our series that will take us through Lent. It is called 10 and 2, Reflections on God's Commandments and Covenant. We've already begun with a prayer. We prayed with the little ones before they were dismissed and discharged to go to Sunday school. So we will dive right into our program. The overview of what we want to accomplish is today we're going to talk about kind of a general overview of the Ten Commandments. I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on looking at the book of Exodus and the whole story. I want to put the Ten Commandments in the proper perspective, and so I'm going to just kind of give you the Cliff's Notes version of the book of Exodus, and then talk about some of the unique aspects of the Ten Commandments. And then, depending on how things end, I don't think things are going to end as neatly as I would have hoped. But hopefully, if we get through the overview today, next week we will talk about the first of the two commandments, no other gods before God, no false idols. The week following, about not taking the Lord's name in vain and keeping holy the Sabbath. The session 4 would be honoring our parents and not murdering. Session 5, no adultery, no stealing. And session 6, no lying and no coveting. So what we want to do, or what my goal is, my goal has always been, I want to take the commandments and I want to really examine them and say, well, what does that mean? What does do not murder mean? Because it's easy for us to say, well, I have never murdered anybody before. But I think we can go even deeper than just having killed a person, another human being. We can ask questions like, have I ever murdered someone's reputation through gossip or false accusations or things of that nature? So, it's kind of taking what we see on the surface and really getting into it a little more deeply. So that's the overview of the program. So today, what I want to focus on is what I'm calling the story of two. The story of two. The story of two. There are 5 distinct things about the Ten Commandments that are signified by the number 2. 5 distinct things about the Ten Commandments. First, there are 2 biblical accounts of the Ten Commandments. That's found in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. There are 2 titles for the Ten Commandments. One is the Ten Commandments, and the other is called the Decalogue. Decalogue is a word that means 10 words. So it's an ancient title for the Ten Commandments. There were 2 sets of 2 tablets. The first ones broke, not just in the Mel Brooks movie, but they actually, in Scripture, the first set broke. And we're going to talk about that today, why that happened. There are 2 traditions of numbering. The Anglican and Eastern Rite churches number the Ten Commandments in one way. Roman Catholics and Lutherans number them in a different way. And we'll talk about that today too. And then there are 2 foci, 2 focuses here, God and neighbor. So if you have 5 distinct things about the Ten Commandments that are signified by the number 2, what is 5 times 2? 10. I can just be making this stuff up. I don't know if it means anything. Nowhere did I read that, this is something significant in terms of the numbers. I just thought it was kind of neat, so I threw it in there. I do that a lot. So we want to take a look at the historical context of the Ten Commandments first, because we all think we kind of know the story and we know pieces of the story, but I want to put it chronologically in order as it is presented in the book of Exodus. Even though Deuteronomy has a recounting of the giving of the Ten Commandments, it's really the book of Exodus where we're going to start. Exodus, of course, is Greek for the word departure. And we will come to a deeper appreciation of what that means in just a moment. So beginning at the beginning, as they say, Exodus 1:8, we read, "Then a new king who knew nothing of Joseph came to power in Egypt." So, who was Joseph and what was his story? What's that? Technicolor Dreamcoat? Yes. So, Joseph, right, was chosen by God to lead his people. That it was Joseph who was sold off into slavery by his brother, and Joseph ascends and eventually becomes a ruler, and that's where we pick up. Joseph has now died, and there is a new king who doesn't know anything of Joseph, so this must be much time later, comes to power in Egypt. And then Exodus 1:9 picks up, "The new king said to his subjects, 'Look how numerous and powerful the Israelite people are growing, more so than ourselves. So what is this new king afraid of? Yeah, he's afraid that the Israelites are going to take over Egypt. His power base is feeling threatened. And so what does this new king command in order to allay his fears? Didn't know we were going to study the Bible, did you?
At church? No way.
He sends them out. Not quite sending them out. He orders the midwives to kill the Hebrew boys that were born. Right? Kind of sounds like the story of after Jesus was born. Right? And the Magi tells Herod that the king, the Messiah, has been born. And so he orders all of the Hebrew boys to be slaughtered. Did the midwives obey that order? No, they did not. They feared God. They knew that that was not the right thing to do. So, this is where we pick up in the story. So a boy is born under this order of that these Hebrew boys are to be killed. A boy is born and the mother hides him for 3 months. The mother hides the boy in a basket in the river, and the boy's sister hides and watches to see what happens to him. There's a lot of hiding here, isn't there? Pharaoh's daughter then goes down to the river and discovers the child. The sister of the boy asks Pharaoh's daughter if she should find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child, and the Pharaoh's daughter agrees to that. So the sister of the baby boy summons the baby's own mother to nurse the child. How neat is that? So the mom sends the boy off, hoping and praying that he's going to be well cared for, and the boy comes back to his mother, and she is the one who nurses him, and then the boy is named Moses. He is then given back over to the Pharaoh's daughter, and that is how Moses' life sort of begins. Moses, recognizing he is a Hebrew, but living kind of in an Egyptian world, sees an Egyptian strike a Hebrew, and so Moses, out of rage and wrath, murders that Egyptian. Now he's afraid. He's afraid that God's wrath, or the wrath of the people around him, are going to rise up against him. So he flees out of Egypt, out of fear. He settles in another land, and he is introduced to a woman. He marries her, and they have a child together. So you see how I'm kind of taking the scripture and I'm just condensing it down for us, hitting the highlights. So while Moses is out one day, he experiences the burning bush, where God reveals to him that God has a special plan for Moses. God then calls Moses to lead his people. Moses is hesitant and uncertain, fearful that nobody's going to believe him. Says that, I'm not an eloquent speaker, I don't think that this is going to work. God challenges Moses to throw his staff on the ground, which then turns into a snake, so that they may believe. So God is saying, Moses, look, I'm going to equip you with certain things that you'll be able to do that will prove to the people in Egypt, both to Pharaoh and to the Israelites, that you are who I say that you are. And so he throws his staff down and it turns into a snake. So it's one of those stories that we hear about Moses, but I just wanted to get this in the right chronology of how things evolved and how complicated this story is. Also, in regards to that, in order for God to prove to Moses that he is being called and that God is powerful, Moses sticks his hand, he tells him to stick his hand inside of his clothes, he pulls it out, it's white, it's kind of leprous, he puts his hand back, it comes out, it's clean, it's fresh, it's new, and so God changes Moses' hand back and forth. God says that if they still won't believe, that Moses should then pour water on the ground and that it will turn to blood. Aaron, Moses' brother, is assigned to Moses to help him because Aaron is a more eloquent speaker. Moses returns to Egypt and reports that God has heard the plea of his people. So Moses gets back to Egypt, tells the Israelites, look, God has heard you. He has sent me. We are here to rescue and to save you. And Moses reports this to Pharaoh as well. Now Pharaoh is enraged that Moses asks for 3 days of prayer for his people. Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, hey, let us go out into the desert for 3 days, and there we will pray and worship our God, but we need to get away from all of the influence of the Egyptians. We need to be in unison with one another and with our God, and so give us 3 days to go pray. Well, Pharaoh he's not down with that. He says, that's not a great idea. We're not going to let you go off for 3 days. So Pharaoh punishes the people because of Moses' request. forcing them to gather their own straw for brickmaking. The straw had been provided them prior to this, and yet Pharaoh says, no, you're going to have to go get your own straw, but your quota for the number of bricks you have to make every day is not going to be reduced. You still have to do the same quota. You're doing more work than you had done previously with the same quota that's still out there. It was an impossible task, is what it boils down to. Moses and Aaron lose favor with their people. So the Israelites are there saying, whoa, hold on, Moses. I don't like your idea. You're really messing things up for us. This is not a good idea. God promises, I will take you as my own people, and you shall have me as your God. And God promises to free his people in that. The Israelites still have a hard heart, and they would not listen. God and Moses kind of negotiate Moses' role in freeing God's people. You know, Moses goes to his people and says, God's going to set us free. Just listen to me, follow me. And the Israelites are saying, no way, Jose, we're not interested in that. And Moses goes back to God and says, look, I don't really think I'm up to this task. I think this is greater than what you're asking. I don't think I can do it. Moses and Aaron go back and visit Pharaoh again. In this visit, Aaron throws down his staff and it turns into a snake in front of Pharaoh. Pharaoh then summons sorcerers and magicians who do the same, but Aaron's snake swallows all the others. That would have been really something to see, wouldn't it? Can you imagine such a thing? What an image. Pharaoh remains obstinate. So you've got all of these negotiations going on. You've got Moses negotiating with Pharaoh, Moses negotiating with the Israelites, Moses negotiating with God. I mean, the poor guy must have been exhausted. God commands Moses and Aaron to strike the river with their staff and to turn it into blood. And then Pharaoh has sorcerers and magicians do the same. So here are these things that God has equipped Moses to do to try to prove to Pharaoh that Moses is a representative of God, and yet Pharaoh comes along and he says, oh, I can match that. I've got magicians and sorcerers who can do the same. So now God is going to up the ante. He has plagues that come across Egypt. And again, we've heard the story about the plagues. We just want to kind of put it in a context. Isn't it interesting that as we're studying the 10 Commandments, we discover that there are 10 plagues? So the first plague is that the river water turns into blood. All the fish die, and so it becomes very stenchy, very nasty. It's not a good place to be at the time. Then you've got the frogs that come along. That gives me the willies. I'm not sure I like frogs that much. And then you got the plague of the gnats. And then you got the plague of the flies, of pestilence. The plague of the flies is something we experience in the Black Hills around August, right? Is that when they come? Pestilence, which was the disease of animals and things of that nature, so cattle were dying off. Then people got boils. And then there was the plague of the hail, which destroyed and demolished all of their crops. You had the plague of the locusts. You had the plague of darkness. And then you had the plague of the death of the firstborn. So just think about this. The death, first of all, with all of these plagues, Pharaoh is obstinate. Now, for most of these plagues, Pharaoh says, as the plague is weighing down on him, Pharaoh says, okay, I give. Moses, make it in. Just do whatever. Just make the frogs go away. Make the boils go away. Make the hail go away. Whatever the case may be. And each time, after those things go away, Pharaoh comes back and says, never mind. And he becomes obstinate again to God's demands, to Moses' demands. So finally, with the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. And what Scripture tells us is that the death of every firstborn human, animal, pet, whatever. If you were the oldest, it doesn't matter how old you were, it doesn't have to be just a child. If you were the firstborn, you died. Sorry, Caroline. I saw you look at your mom and go, whoa, I'm the firstborn. So that is the thing that sends out this wailing cry throughout Egypt that Pharaoh finally broke, and he sends the Israelites out of Egypt. Before the death of the firstborn plague hits, though, God, through Moses, tells the Israelite people about the Passover, that they are to roast and eat a lamb. They are to put blood on their doorpost and on their lintel, which is above the doorway, and they are to eat unleavened bread. And that the night will come, the Spirit of God will go through Egypt, and slay the firstborn of the land, but will pass up the houses of those with blood on the doorposts and those who have observed the Passover. And so the firstborn of the Egyptians are slain, and Pharaoh finally breaks down and sends the Israelites out of Egypt. Now remember, Moses had only asked for 3 days in the desert. Now Pharaoh is saying, just get out of here. We're done with you. We can't take this anymore. So God, who has slain the firstborn of the Egyptians, now is asking or commanding the consecration of the firstborn of the Israelite people, that the firstborn be consecrated to God. In sending them out into the desert, God sends them the long way around out of Egypt, because it says God thought, should the peoples that they would have to fight, should the people see that they would have to fight, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. In other words, there was a shorter way that the Egyptians could have gone. The Israelites could have gone. There was a shorter route, but there were armies of people in those areas, and so if the Israelites would have seen that they were going to have to fight, God knew how temperamental they were. He was afraid that they would have turned around and gone right back to Egypt. So Moses takes Joseph's bones out of Egypt, and again, that's in verse 19. You might take a look at that. There's some significance about that. God preceded them by a column of cloud in day and a column of fire at night. So God is leading them out through this path. So they're not just wandering in the desert aimlessly by themselves, as we might think, but is actually following God. Pharaoh questions what he's done and sends his army after the Israelites. So first he throws them out. Pharaoh sounds like a wishy-washy kind of guy, doesn't he? Yeah, he can't seem to make up his mind about things. And so he sends his army after the Israelites. The Israelites then are fearful and they complain to Moses. The cloud that's leading them, the cloud that is God, moves behind the Israelites, between them and the pursuing Egyptians, kind of as a barrier, as a block. The Red Sea gets parted. We've seen that with Charlton Heston. The Israelites travel through to safety while the Egyptians then are covered by the sea. So there's a lot that's happened, hasn't there? Yes? Yeah. It's exhausting. I'm tired already. Moses and the Israelites, they sing praise to the Lord. Oh, we've been rescued, we've been saved, we've seen this incredible miracle. Israelites grumble to Moses that they have no water to drink because the water was too bitter. God then commands Moses to throw a piece of wood into the water, and the water miraculously becomes fresh. Again, it's a sign that God is taking care of his people. It was here that the Lord, in making rules and regulations for them, put them to the test. If you really listen to the voice of the Lord your God, he told them, and do what is right in his eyes, if you heed his commandments, this is the first time in Scripture we're beginning to see the commandments make an appearance, and keep all his precepts, I will not afflict you with any of the diseases with which I afflicted the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. Keep the commandments, and I won't do to you all the stuff that you saw done in Egypt. I think that's a pretty fair deal, don't you? I would have been horrified. I think they would have been horrified based on some of the things that they had witnessed. So moving into Exodus chapter 16, having set out from Elim, the whole Israelite community came into the desert of, what's the name of the desert? Anybody know? Who said it? Did I hear somebody say it?
I said Sahara.
Sahara? The desert called Sin. Oh! Now, again, this is just like the 5 times 2 thing. This is just a Chris Roussel thing. This is not something that biblical scholars are announcing as the irony of the name. I don't know what the name means, frankly, but I just thought it was interesting that the name of the desert is the desert of sin. And then, in a minute, we're going to hear the 10 Commandments, which are given on the Mount Sinai. Now, I don't know if there's any significance to that. I'm not a biblical scholar, and I'm certainly no Hebrew scholar, but it just kind of struck me as interesting, so I thought I'd throw it in there. The Israelites grumbled that at least they had food in Egypt instead of starving in the desert, and then quail and manna are given by God. Moses says, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Keep an omer full of manna for your descendants, that they may see what food I gave you to eat in the desert when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." Moses then told Aaron, "Take an urn and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord in safekeeping for your descendants. So Aaron placed it in front of the commandments for safekeeping, as the Lord had commanded Moses. This image right here, this image of the manna that came down from heaven, they took an omerful and they put it in the ark, which is a lot like the manna that we take from our altar and put in the tabernacle, right? So there's all kinds of connections here to God caring for his people and feeding them. The Israelites grumble again against Moses that there is no water to drink. They've moved on, and so the water that they had before, they moved away from that water source. There is no water to drink. God commands Moses to strike a rock with a staff, which he does, and out pours the water. All this happens, and then Amalek wages war on the Israelites. Amalek is an army. It's a group of, as I understand it, not very bright, but very forceful and very powerful army. So they wage war on the Israelites. Moses, during the battle, climbs a hill, holds a staff in his hand. Israelites win as Moses holds his hands aloft, and they lose when his hands begin to sag and get tired. So Moses, they sit him down. Aaron and Hur support Moses' hands, and victory is achieved. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, who knew that Jethro was a biblical name? I didn't know that. Makes me think of Gomer Pyle, or Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah.
Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, brings Moses' wife and son to meet Moses in the desert, and it is there that Jethro witnesses Moses serving as a judge and mediator between people and God. Jethro advises Moses to set up a series of judges to help Moses. 3 months into the journey, they arrive finally at Sinai, and Moses visits God on the mountain. God says, "Tell the Israelites, you have seen for yourselves how I treated the Egyptians. Remember all the plagues? And how I bore you up on eagle wings and brought you here to myself. Therefore, if you hearken to my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my special possession, dearer to me than all other people, though all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." The people all answered together, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." God is beginning to establish this covenant with his people at Mount Sinai, saying, "Look at all the things that I've done for you. Now I want to enter into a special relationship with you." God gives instructions that the people are to wash themselves and their garments and prepare for the third day, and to not go up the mountain or touch its base, because it's so holy. And then God appears in verses 16 to 25. God appears to Moses. The 10 Commandments are then given, and the Israelites fear God. Exodus 21 to 23, additional laws and directives are given, and a reward of fidelity is outlined. God saying, "If you keep my commandments, I will be your God. This is what I will bless you with." Then we move into Exodus 24. Moses, Aaron, and 70 elders invited to worship God on the mountain, but Moses is invited to go to God even a little bit closer. Sacrifices are made, and Moses took half of the blood and put it in large bowls. The other half he splashed on the altar. Taking the book of the covenant, he read it aloud to the people, who answered, "All that the Lord has said we will heed and do." Then he took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you, in accordance with all these words of his." Kind of reminds me of the language that we use in the Eucharistic prayer, where Jesus speaks of blood of the new covenant, right? So there are some connections between what happened there at Mount Sinai and what Jesus does and has done for us. Moving along, the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain, and while you are there, I will give you the stone tablets on which I have written the commandments intended for their instruction." Moses passed into the midst of the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and there he stayed for 40 days and 40 nights. We'll hear about that today in church. So that's Exodus 24:18. Then we get into Exodus 25, where we hear about the plans for the ark, the table, and the lampstand. So Moses is at the mountain, and he's getting these instructions from God. It's all written down in Exodus 25. Then Exodus 26 through 31, instructions for the priesthood, altars, incense. The way in which God wants to be worshipped is outlined to Moses. And that takes, all those chapters there. So then, in Exodus 31:18, remember, Moses had been on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. When the Lord had finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the commandments, the stone tablets inscribed by God's own finger. Can you imagine a stone tablet that God's own finger had written on. How sacred that would be considered by the Hebrew people. Yes, Niall?
To your knowledge, sir, that 40 days and 40 nights, does that hold any symbology at all?
Any symbolism, the 40 days and 40 nights? Most certainly.
It may not have been 40 days. It may have been like a euphemism for a very long time.
It might have been a euphemism for a very long time, but we see the notion of 40 days and 40 nights repeat itself over and over in Scripture. So I would hold it as significant, even if it is symbolic.
Okay.
Yeah. So God's own finger has inscribed these stones. The people grumble about Moses' delay. He's been there for 40 days and 40 nights. They've already been in the desert for 3 months, we've seen, and for another month, Moses is up on the mountain, and they begin to grumble about Moses' delay and ask Aaron to build them a golden calf. And Aaron, I don't know why, but Aaron agrees. He says, give me all of your gold rings, earrings, jewelry, and they melt it all down, and they make a golden calf. God is angry and threatens to strike down the people, and Moses pleads with God and reminds God of the covenant that they have just ratified together on the mountain. Moses then turned and came down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the commandments in his hands. Tablets that were written on both sides, front and back. Tablets that were made by God, having inscriptions on them that were engraved by God himself. As he drew near the camp, Moses saw the calf and the dancing. With that, Moses' wrath flared up, so that he threw the tablets down and broke them on the base of the mountain. Can you imagine? You're holding these tablets that God's own finger has inscribed, and you're so mad you have to throw them down on the ground. Can you imagine that? Must have been very frustrating. So this is Mel Brooks actually dropping the 15 commandments. I just think that's a funny story. I like that way. But it's kind of funny because Moses did drop the tablets. He did throw them down, not out of error, but out of rage. So Moses commands those remaining faithful to the Lord to slay those who are not. So Moses, we already saw at the beginning of the book of Exodus, Moses killed an Egyptian when he was a young man, because the Egyptian had struck a Hebrew person, a Hebrew slave. And so now Moses is commanding that they slay all those who were somewhat responsible for this disobedience to God. And it says in Scripture that day there fell 3,000 of the people. Moses goes back to God to make atonement for their sin. God promises the people the land flowing with milk and honey, but tells them that they are a stiff-necked people, and that God will no longer lead them to the land in the form of the cloud and the fire. Rather, an angel is going to lead them. Moses meets with God in the tent, and the people would worship God while Moses and God were meeting in the tent. God passes by Moses in one of their meetings, allowing Moses to see his back, but not his face. For no human, no living person can see the face of God and live. The stone tablets are renewed and made all over again. Then the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with them I have made a covenant with you and Israel. So Moses stayed there with the Lord again for 40 days and 40 nights without eating any food or drinking any water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. Moses' face becomes radiant, so much so that he has to wear a veil over his face anytime he comes out of the tent. When he goes into the tent to see God, that's when he raises the veil. To be so close to God in that way kind of emanates from Moses himself. We're going to hear today in Sacred Scripture at church about the Transfiguration and the experience of Jesus, who radiates an enormous amount of light. So that's the story from Exodus. That kind of puts it into context. All of the things that this wrestling back and forth, this infidelity and fidelity, and this negotiating, I mean, it does seem quite exhausting. And so to stop and think about the infidelity of the people and God's repetitious fidelity to his people, to us, is really awe-inspiring. So there are 2 versions of this 10 Commandments story. One is found in Exodus and one is in Deuteronomy. And when you put them side by side, they're identical. I mean, there's a little bit of a difference in some of the verbiage between the 2, but for the most part, they are almost nearly identical. So they're numbered, the Ten Commandments are numbered a little bit differently in two different traditions. So on the left side we have the Anglican and the Greek Eastern Orthodox tradition, which flows out of the Jewish tradition, and the Roman Catholic and Lutheran tradition, which kind of comes out of a tradition promulgated by St. Augustine. And the difference is that you have here, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods but me. And then number 2 is no false idols. Whereas here, you have, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no strange gods before me, therefore you shall not make any false idols, is all falls under 1. So for us, we divide it 1 and 2, they take it and they make it number 1 here. Then when you get down to the bottom, the way you make up for that is, we say, you don't covet anything. No coveting of anything. Wife, neighbor's slaves, ox, ass, nothing. Here, it's divided up. So up here, it's combined, and then divided down here. No coveting of wife next door, and no coveting of boat next door. That's the only thing I can think of when I was putting that together. We always like to say, we don't need a boat, we just need somebody, we need a friend with a boat. So that's how they line up, and that's why, in some instances, if you and a friend of another tradition are talking about the 10 Commandments, and you say, I've violated the 7th commandment, you know, they might look at you and say, oh my goodness gracious. Anyway, that's it. So the 10 Commandments address our relationship with 2 separate entities. Okay? First, the focus is God. In Commandments 1 through 4, it's all about our relationship with God. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods but me. You shall not worship false idols. You shall not use my name in vain. You shall keep holy the Sabbath. So the first focus of the 10 Commandments is the way in which we interact with and treat God in God's name. The second focus is on our neighbor. So Commandments 5 through 10, honor father and mother. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, and thou shalt not covet anything, including your neighbor's boat. So this has to do with how we treat one another. The first one, about how we treat God. The second half, how we treat one another. One of the things that's really important is that violation against one is really a violation against the other. So that if we violate, for instance, one of the sins, one of the commandments up here, we are in some way harming our relationship and violating one of the commandments down here. So they're all interconnected. I want to tell you a little bit about the structure of the 10 Commandments and how they fall into a set pattern that was common at the time, that people back then would have understood as a type of treaty. So the structure of the Decalogue is based on a type of treaty known at that time. At that time, there were 2 different types of treaties. The first one is the parity treaty. That took place between 2 equal kings. Each side agrees to mutual responsibilities because they have equal status, and neither can force the other to carry out their obligation. There's parity in the relationship. In the vassal treaty, it's made between an overlord, a major power, and the small nations that were either conquered by him or forced to cooperate lest he take them over. The overlord usually does not bind himself to any particular duties beyond being kindly and protective of the vassal, but he does spell out a series of demands for the vassal to faithfully perform. So one of them, I'm not sure what my next slide is. So one of them is between equals. That was the first one I showed you, the parity treaty. And one is between a power that's stronger than the other. The vassal treaty is the type of treaty that the 10 Commandments is based on. And I'll show you that here with the next slide. So the way a vassal treaty was structured, you have the preamble up here. The overlord or great king gives his name and his title. And we read, I, the Lord, am your God. that God is announcing who he is. Then, in the vassal treaty, there is a historical prologue. The great king lists his past acts of kindness to the vassal as the reason for the vassal's obligation to obey. God says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. So God gives this historical prologue. Then there are stipulations or demands in this treaty. The overlord binds the vassal to keep these demands. That's where God then says, you shall have no other God before me. There shall be no false idols. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. These are the stipulations and demands of the Ten Commandments. And then it was custom to enact and confirm the treaty. Deposit of the treaty in a temple and public readings at set times. So it had to be written down in some way so that it could be deposited. It wasn't just a verbal agreement. We see that with the stone tablets. They were deposited in a very permanent way on those stone tablets. They were put into the Ark of the Covenant, and they were kept, and they were read, and we still read them and honor them today. Now, the last two parts of the vassal treaty were not necessarily applicable with the Ten Commandments. Because under a vassal treaty, the next part would be witnesses. For a solemn state covenant, the witnesses are the gods of the two lands. They would basically say, may the God of your land and the God of my land keep us in check with one another. And so, because there is no other God than our God alone, there couldn't be an agreement where God said, my God we will honor, and your God you will honor, and that's what's going to keep us in check. That doesn't jive with what God was trying to accomplish. So the witnesses thing is not applicable, and then curses and blessings. At the end of the treaty, the divine beings maintain the treaty in the divine courtroom by imposing rewards and penalties. Again, it's not applicable because it's between God and his people, and the witnesses aren't there. Does that make sense? I know what I'm trying to say in my head, but my mouth is having a hard time keeping up. Does this make sense? Why we wouldn't have the last two as part of the Ten Commandments?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So there are other important notes about the Ten Commandments that I'd like us to be aware of. First is that Exodus chapters 1 through 18 relates the story of Moses and Israel's move from slavery to freedom. And we went through those chapters, chapter by chapter, just a moment ago. But Exodus 19 through 40, then Leviticus 1 through 27, then Numbers 1 through 10, all describe a single stay at Mount Sinai where God made a covenant with Israel. So the amount of historical documentation about the Ten Commandments far exceeds the stuff leading up to it. The Ten Commandments are the core of the Sinaitic covenant. And when we look at what that means, that covenant, it means a bond or a fetter. It really means that the people were chained to God in a passionate way. It's important to remember that the covenant is God initiated. That God went out and sought these people and asked them to enter into this covenant with him. That God is always seeking us out. The Hebrews of the Exodus were a no people, but they became united among themselves because they were united to the same God. How many tribes of Israel were there? 12, right? This tribe that came out of Egypt was only one small tribe, one small part of the whole of the Israelite people. And so God initially made this covenant, this pact with the Ten Commandments with just one small sect. It encompassed one small tribe and was then adopted by all of the tribes, thus uniting the people to each other and to God, and yet setting them apart from other pagan groups that were in the world. Their social and political bond did not depend on royal or imperial dynasties, shrines, or teamwork required for flood control or military defense. Rather, their bond was dependent on the disclosure and the proximity of a passionately purposive God. It was their relationship with God that brought them together. That's what united them. Israel then became the world's priest, not for privilege, but for task or service. They were tasked with being a sign and a symbol to the rest of the world. And that's why we know that Jesus came not just for the people of God, the Hebrew people, but for the entire world. By creating a union between Yahweh and Israel, the covenant separated the new people from all other nations and Yahweh from all other gods. It was a different kind of relationship. He was a different kind of God than what many of the people in the world knew at the time. The price of the sense of mission and awareness of theological election was cultural isolation with the risk of national arrogance. So, if I enter into a unique and special relationship with God, and God has adopted me in a special way and sends me out into this task in the world, I do run the risk of saying, hey, I've got it all figured out. Me and God, we're tight. And I need to tell you about this, and I need to let you know how to live. And so that is one of the risks of God adopting a certain set of people, was cultural isolation and a risk of national arrogance. The Ten Commandments are not law, rather they are a basis for law, because they give no conditions and no suggested penalties. When Moses broke the tablets, he did so coram populo, or before the people. This was a solemn judicial act signifying that Yahweh was no longer bound by the agreement. So it's not just that Moses throws the tablets down on the ground because he's angry. He actually did it as a judicial act, saying this covenant is hereby dispensed with. We're not bound by this covenant. And really what Moses was saying was God is no longer bound by this covenant, because you have already violated the covenant. I haven't even been down the mountain. I've been up in the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, and you're already violating the covenant I just ratified. This action reinforces that the Ten Commandments are not one-sided, but is a treaty. You will be my people, and I will be your God. By breaking the tablets, it breaks the treaty, and it frees both sides from the treaty. But of course we know that that's not how the rest of the story ends. In the first set of tablets, God's finger wrote the commandments. In the second set, Moses penned them. So that seems to suggest to me, anyway, again, I'm no biblical scholar, it just seems to me that there's great significance in the first set, the notion that it's written with God's finger, something that God actually touched, versus Moses writing it and pinning it out. And I don't know what to make of that. Okay. That's a lot of stuff, isn't it? Did I go too fast?
No.
I have a tendency to do that. I kind of get wrapped up in it. I'm trying to slow myself down. Do we have any questions about? Yes, Kay.
And I may have missed it. You covered a lot of territory here. Do you think there was any differences in the commandments from the set that he broke, from the one to the second set that was?
The question is, do I think there's any differences between the first set that was broken and the second set? I don't think so, just based on the way it's described in the book of Exodus. I think if there would have been some differences, I don't know, maybe Mel Brooks said it right, maybe there were 15 and then they went down to 10. But I don't think so, based on what I was looking at in Exodus. I think they were probably the same. Yes, ma'am.
What exactly constitutes a false idol?
A false idol, we're going to talk about that next week, but it's anything that we worship, anything that we hold as lofty and ideal that is something other than God. So it can be anything from, well, I'm going to get into it. I'm going to get into it in a lot of detail next week, actually. But it's an excellent question. Yes, Keith.
How many years transpired
20?
in this Exodus?
The 40 years.
40.
40 years in the desert is what historically and traditionally we hold. Kind of like what Niall was saying, whether or not that is symbolic or not, I'm not quite sure. I mean, when you look at it, by the time Moses dies, I forget how old they said he was, like 600 or 800 years old. I mean, is a year at that time? I don't quite know. Yes, Joseph?
And maybe I'm playing devil's advocate here, but why did Moses get so mad when he didn't even give the Israelites a chance to read the 10 Commandments? They didn't know the rules yet. Maybe they should have known already, or I don't know.
You know, it's a good question. And one of the things as you go through the book of Exodus that you quickly realize is that biblical chronology doesn't always follow actual chronology. And so, is it possible that they had seen the 10 Commandments before he broke them? I don't know. But I think that, Moses was engaged in this really spiritual experience, coming face to face with God. I mean, put yourself in Moses' position for a moment, and you're up there, and you're getting all of these instructions from God, and as soon as you walk down the mountain, you're already in the hole.
Really?
You've already you violated the first commandment. No other gods before me. And boom, there's the golden calf, and they're all dancing around, and Yes, Niall.
To make this very short, you mentioned that the covenant was originally made with one tribe.
Yes.
And then the other 11 joined in.
Right.
Is there any evidence as to what that tribe was, and is that the tribe that became the priests?
Yeah, it was the. I want to say it was a tribe called the tribe of Joseph, Joseph's tribe from Egypt. But I'd have to go back and look at my notes, and because I don't remember the specifics, whether or not that was the tribe that became the tribe of priests, like the Levites. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
Somebody smarter than me out there knows.
Okay.
So,
Thanks.
yes, Nicole.
What were the other 11 tribes doing at this time?
Well, they were scattered. They weren't all in the same area or the same place. So they were kind of doing their own thing. Good question, but I guess the short answer is I don't really know. But they just weren't all geographically connected. Anybody else? Anything else? Wow. Can you believe we got through it? I'm sorry if I rushed too fast, but perfect timing. Thanks, everybody. God bless you. Tuesday night, we'll have the pancake supper and the evening prayer with a reflection by my friend, Father Joel. And then Wednesday is Ash Wednesday at 12:15 and at 7 p.m. I hope to see you there. God bless you.